audience. I have a background in industrial organizational psychology, and I lead talent, people analytics, and all the other HR COEs for Booster. We have about a 450 person company, and just for the context of this panel, we are both Crosschq, TalentWall, and Greenhouse users. So if you have any interest in knowing more about what that's like, I think I'm a pretty good resource.
Hi, I'm Jo Avent. I'm a CPO now at Crosschq, having just been acquired. I was a co-founder at TalentWall. I started my career as an agency recruiter back in London in the late 90s, and had kind of grown up through agency side, had gone in-house recruiting, was on software project teams, and really during that time, and then subsequently heading up talent teams, during that time really kind of found that recruiting was something of a black box, and actually getting access to data and getting the whole team on the same page of what's really going on under the hood was challenging. So that's kind of what started off TalentWall and looking at efficiency. And now the combination of Crosschq and TalentWall, we're really looking at quality of hire and efficiency through the pipeline and that kind of collaboration piece.
I'm Brian Jacobson. I'm head of global talent at Sumo Logic. We've got a team of 25 recruiters around the world. We're about 950 people right now. We're hiring probably 500 plus this year.
Awesome. All right, let's start with you in terms of definitionally, because I think we probably all have different opinions on this four-letter word, quality of hire. Define it. What does it mean to you?
Quality of hire. I mean, I think about this a lot because the organization I've been in, I've sometimes wondered if we've thought about it enough. But for me, it's making sure the people that we find are successful in that organization, and that we're bringing those right people in. I mean, that's the key. And I've thought a lot about more recently how we're going to track that, how we're going to define what a success profile is, and things like that.
Cole, for you.
Yeah, I take kind of a different lens on it. We're approaching HR from a pretty different perspective. We want to go data first in everything that we do, which ultimately does lead to quantity of hire, which I think we can probably beat up on a little bit on this panel. But quality of hire is really, if you think about it from like a baseball context, quantity of hire is just your number of at-bats. But would you stop there if you're running a Major League Baseball team? No, you'd want to know your batting average. Right? That's your quality of hire. What's your hit rate? How many rock stars are you bringing in? And maybe, from a cultural standpoint, how many people are kind of flaming out in the organization, and how can you contribute to them sticking around longer?
Jill, yeah.
Well, obviously the baseball analogies leave me a little confused. I'll trust that Cole knows what he's talking about there. So I think it's really interesting, and as recruiters primarily in this room, I think we all are, my primary concern and the person I'm really thinking about a lot in this instance is the candidate themselves. And there is a really interesting disambiguation maybe here that we could lean into or kind of explore a little bit more about. When we talk about quality of hire, are we talking about that human being? Are we talking about that person's quality? Or is it more about, we had this job requirement, and how close did we come from a team and process perspective? How close did we come of really fulfilling, the requirements that we had set out to fulfill?
Yeah, I love that, Brian. To you, on this gets to okay, how do we calculate this thing? So we're talking about, I think we can appreciate there's some ambiguity. I know you mentioned earlier you were at a decacorn, you're at a unicorn, you've been all the corns. And give us a little insight into how your former companies have thought about it, calculated it, and maybe part of why has it been so challenging for us to reliably calculate it.
Yeah, well, I think there's a gap between what happens in the business and what comes back to the talent team a lot of times. So a lot of the evidence that I get is anecdotal, going to meeting with hiring managers or leaders, or going to the gatherings and finding out, hey, were they successful? And a lot of times, you probably heard this before, you'll say, oh, that person's great, hire me more like that person. And it's not really exploring or setting recruiting even up for success by really identifying those characteristics and traits that are what are driving that success and helping us track those things.
And Cole, as the data guy, tell us a little bit about why you think it's been so complicated for companies to take advantage of that.
Personally, I actually don't see it as complicated. And I think that's where maybe I'm a little bit of an outlier. But I think if you can start with simplicity first and get buy-in to that simplicity, it becomes easy a lot quicker, right? And so when I think about quality of hire, I think about it objectively and subjectively, right? So on the objective side, like at Booster, we're using this for all of our frontline population. And we have things like productivity scores that are objective, we have safety scores that are objective, we have driver safety, we have a variety of different metrics. And essentially, you just take an average of those when somebody is 30, 60, 90 days into the job. That's very simple, and everybody is on board, right? Now, when you get into kind of that headquarters type of employee, that talented, that engineering workforce, that sales workforce, it does become a little bit more complicated, and therefore, I would always recommend starting with something simple and then layering on complexity. Some of the easy things are just, assessing if a manager would rehire someone. What is their 90-day attrition with the organization? And one of the things I love, and Joe and I were talking about this earlier, my personal favorite is how is this person contributing to the success of the team, right? And so kind of pivoting from that quality of hire to quality of contribution. I think we had a pretty good discussion about that earlier.
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, it's that piece about the human themselves and then thinking about the ecosystem you're putting that candidate, that employee into, and what responsibility does the company have as well for that person's success. So thinking about quality of hire, quality of contribution, and then even looking at quality of onboarding, and how are you, providing the right tools, resources, and ecosystem for that new hire to be successful and contribute in the way that you hope that they can.
Well, I think this is where you have that difference between, is the onus on the hire themselves to onboard themselves and to be, to really accelerate their time to productivity? Or is it on the organization to ensure they're set up for success and that they're being included and that, we're valuing people's differences and all of those good things that we're all in this for?
Yeah, I think as a remote culture in this world we're living in today, that conversation is getting even more important. And we see a lot of that with the onboarding as well.
When we started to tackle this issue with real data and talk to talent leaders, the out-of-the-box response to quality of hire was, it's a combination between tenure and performance, 50-50 should be an opening algorithm, and recruiters and TA doesn't own that metric after day 90. This was basically the average response that we got. And we've learned really quickly that, gosh, it's not a 50-50 weight between tenure and performance for different job types, like you just mentioned. It's funny, walking over here from the hotel, I'm looking at all these people working, I'm like, oh God, these are very different dimensions, right? From the doctor that's walking in to the hospital to the individual working at Starbucks. So it's just a different formula. So to that end, in terms of ownership of this metric, this has been one of the hot potato items. Where do you think it lives? Where do you think it should live going forward?
Yes, it's a great question. We should collaborate, and this data should be open, and we should define who's going to kind of monitor and help that data. But what I've seen in the organizations I've been with is it's very siloed, and that data doesn't come back to. If I were to ask the recruiters on my team, how are the people doing that you hired? Like, I'm pretty sure they would have no idea. No one's feeding that information back. So without breaking down those barriers and those walls, that is going to be really hard to track.
I kind of look at it like a racing chart, right? And the person who's responsible for this metric is really the head of talent acquisition. But who's accountable, right? I think it's hiring managers. I think it's recruiters. I think it's the executive team of the organization. And ultimately, I actually see the executive team as one of the areas when you aggregate this metric beyond just the individuals that are at play, but over time, that's who it should be reported to. And they're looking at what is the quality of talent that we're bringing into the organization.
Yeah, I think as a recruiter, if I'm going to take responsibility for something or accountability for something, I want to have had a voice in the setting up of that metric in the first place, and to kind of even accept, yes, this is possible for me to achieve this. So I think that's an important and sort of first step, is to make sure that the right people are involved in the conversation in the setup phase. And then in terms of, I think you kind of alluded to, Mike, there's like an expiry date or a statute of limitations kind of thing with you know, after 6 months, it's not on me anymore if this isn't working out. And I think that's a very valid position for a recruiter to take. There is an expiry date, and then what is that? What is that period? I think is, you know, you have to figure that out amongst the team. But
it's going to be different in different organizations, but really a recruiter and the recruiting team, the talent team, partners with the business to help identify. Like, we can walk them through if they're looking for certain core competencies. We can help them define how they are going to set up interview questions for that. But we're not going to define a lot of that for the hiring manager. We can help, but it's this partnership that goes. So as it's this partnership, then it becomes confusing as who's the owner, because it's so many different pieces of the business.
Well, do you mind if I build off that for a second? Because I think with this audience, you're probably thinking, what's in it for me, right? If I'm coming at this, I'm assuming from like a recruiter perspective, what's in it for me? And I think about, like, there's two aspects. One is, imagine you are the rock star recruiter, but you're not getting the love that you deserve because there's no way of quantifying the talent that you're bringing in. This is a true equalizer of sorts in that regard. But the other is, what if you have poor hiring managers? Everybody in this room knows when the hiring managers are not bought into your processes, they're not the kind of people that are really trying to bring in the talent that you're trying to bring in. How can you equalize them in a way? Well, quality of hire is going to be a tool that can help you in that regard.
I love that, and I love data. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about data. So I want to go down the row here first and have each of you tell us a myth you debunked through data as it relates to this concept of quality of hire.
Sure, I can start. I think when I joined the previous company I was at, you want to find out about the role. So you talk to everybody and say, all right, here's the role, here's what we're looking for. And then what I did is just charted out every single person in the organization. I went through their LinkedIn, I put the last 3 companies they worked at, the skill sets that they had, so I could really dig deep to understand what we were looking for. And for this particular role, they were very against hiring anyone that had networking background for some reason. And as I went through and looked at all the people, and then I had them highlight the top performers, most of them had a networking background. And just by looking at the data, I was easily kind of able to say, hey, let's open our eyes to, actually, this is a core competency that we're looking for, and really change the profile.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of examples spring to mind, actually. So one of them was someone that we were talking with a couple of months ago, who had a great example of this, and he had benchmarked his internal sales team, and the VP of sales, I guess, was convinced that they needed to hire all jocks and folks that had done athletics at college and all that good sporty stuff. They'd understand your baseball analogies, I suspect. But when they looked at the data, it turned out that the most successful salespeople in the team actually were moms who just had come back from mat leave. And as a mom who has been on mat leave and come back and tell you those people are knocking it out of the park on a daily basis. So that was a shock, I think, for him, and a revelation, and transformed the way that they did hiring. But a personal example I had was at ThoughtWorks. We were hiring developers, incredibly competitive. If any of you are tech recruiters, you know the deal. We were hiring developers, we were looking for top colleges, great resumes, all the big names, and all that stuff. And it's so difficult, and so much competition. And what we actually found when we really looked was what we really needed was people who could just learn really, really quickly. And that, at the end of the day, trumped everything else. And when we really lent into that and hiring it, opened up a whole new world of candidates as well.
Yeah, my team at Booster knows this. I love this quote from Henry Ford. If you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. I love that quote. And so I think, and kind of both of your stories touch on this, and mine will as well, that if you're always looking for the same candidate that has done the role historically, you're leaving talent on the table, right? And so I'll tell two stories. One with a previous organization working with distribution centers, and we were trying to hire for forklift drivers en masse, right? And so what we did is what they always did, which is we looked for previous forklift experience. And one of the things that we found out is our forklifts were a little bit different than the traditional forklift, and so people were sputtering and falling out really quickly. And what we looked at the job itself, and it looked kind of like a video game. And so we started looking at our profile and looking at that quality of hire, and we found that gamers were actually one of our greatest resources for hiring these forklift drivers. So we completely pivoted what we were doing in terms of recruiting. We have the same thing right now at Booster, where we're hiring for drivers, and we cannot retain a traditional truck driver to work at Booster to save our life, right? We had like 180% turnover when I started. We're down to 120%. We're still definitely not there. But what we've looked for and we've pivoted towards is we can train people to be a driver. We can get them a CDL license, but what we can't do is train service. And so we've gone directly into service industries and started plucking those employees. Now, given they have a higher rate of turnover, but not as high as the truckers, but our turnover rate has gone down significantly, and our quality of service has gone up. And so this is a really great test case for how quality of hire can make a difference.
So awesome. I think those are great stories. I'm sure the whole audience here all has our own version of myths that we've debunked. Let's get specific on some data, and I want you all to react to it. So, Crosschq now has a product with Greenhouse where we're able to do all kinds of correlations on pre-hire data to quality of hire. One of those is interview scores. And so we recently published a report that found that interview scores have a 9% correlation to quality of hire. That's 9, as in less than 10, right? So I'm curious as to, does it surprise you, and why do you think that might be?
No, that doesn't surprise me, and it's because we haven't put enough thought into what a great scorecard, what a great interview process looks like, right? So we've probably all at least sat with the leaders of the group and they've thought about what a success profile looks like. But did we really develop the scorecard in the interview so that it is trackable and were we measuring the success? I'm not surprised by that, but I think we can fix it.
The thing I would say to that is quality of hire is not an end, it's a means to the end, right? And so if I'm looking at our scorecards and say, why are these poor? We should be looking at the behaviors that are driving it being poor and coaching and training from like an interview training perspective. And one of the things that we're trying to use it for internally right now is how do we create a cadre of talent selectors. These are our best interviewers in the whole company. These are the folks that are actually filling out the Greenhouse scorecards, not just acting like they do it. And they're doing a good job assessing talent. What if we can overly focus on getting those people in front of candidates rather than just your mediocre hiring manager?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of this thing, because the other stuff we're seeing is that the experience of these interviewers I think more than 50% of folks that did interviews had only done 2 or less interviews that year. Think about that for a second, right? And like, how the heck are you going to get really good at interviewing and assessing talent if you're only doing 2 interviews as a year as part of a hiring panel? Right?
We need a driver's license to drive a car.
You kind of do, right? All right, I'll give you another one from a channel perspective. So internal referrals, which we know are extraordinarily efficient. We've seen in many companies they're the least productive quality channel of new hires. Does that surprise you?
Back to me. No, because an internal referral is all this warm biases going towards it. They get through faster, they do less checking. It's a different sort of interview most of the time, right? Because we're not training our people that every interview should be identifying these certain attributes. So it does not surprise me at all.
I would say yes, it does surprise me, but it's mostly where it doesn't surprise me is to your comment about like your walk here and all the different professions you came across. Is like, yeah, for some of those professions, a referral is going to absolutely be helpful, but in a lot of cases, maybe it won't.
All right, the last one, controversial. We have an enterprise client who does 4 pre-hire assessments. And through the analysis, we found that 2 of those are not only horrible candidate experiences, but they have literally no correlation to quality. And one of those is a heavy cognitive, almost IQ test that they have done for over a decade. So not only are those products sort of riddled with bias in our opinion, but once you can see on paper that there's no correlation to a quality outcome decision, you sort of your eyes open.
I mean, I'll take a stab at this, which is that offends me on so many levels, mostly because they should have measured that 10 years ago and known that. And think about all the people that were disaffected over that period of time that shouldn't have been because they weren't measuring things properly, right? And when Joe and I were talking about this earlier, we talked about, well, what if quality of hire is disaffecting certain populations more than others? And well, quality of hire is always going to have multiple factors to it. And if you have some factors that are disproportionately affecting a group, take them out. There's no need to put them in there out of like sheer will of force or something like this. Do what's right for your organization. And so measurement can be, you know, the worst enemy, but it can also be your best friend, right?
Yeah, I mean, as an efficiency nerd, I both adore the fact that this revelation came to them and they can just knock out a whole, you know, redundant step in the process. And I'm just so frustrated on their behalf that, to Cole's point, all those candidates that could have been a great fit and now have this horrible experience, and all the time wasted. It's just so unfair and so needless. It's just such an ick. So that's, for me, that's a huge win as folks come through the process, improving candidate experience, but saving everybody's time and just greasing the wheels feels so good.
Yeah, I'm going to second those things and just turn it back to you there. I mean, that's a lot of the assessments being done. So especially if they're redundant and yeah.
So kind of continuing on that theme around diversity and our efforts in our hiring processes, how can getting more data like this help enhance our efforts around building more diverse teams?
You know, I think what's interesting about this is like the European model versus the US model, where in Europe, at least this is my understanding, that they don't collect any diversity-related data. So how could you possibly, you know if what you're doing is working? Whereas in the United States, they've really leaned into making sure that we're collecting diversity data because it's going to prove out if what we're doing is working. Like when I talked about, we're doing kind of a full tear down and rebuild of traditional HR, the rebuild is based around this question of how do you know what you're doing is working? It's a really simple question, it's a really complex answer to that question, but if you want to really commit to D&I efforts, you have to know what you're doing is working, and the only way you can know is with data.
I mean, yeah, the data is going to help remove some biases. There's going to be biases that exist as you're collecting that data, so you have to, data in is data out, but, I can see the value of that data to help remove those biases.
I think I really like, the reason why I like the greenhouse scorecards, and they're so good, and why it is a bit eat your vegetables, but if you can encourage folks to fill out those scorecards, you have something repeatable and point-toable and objective, hopefully, if you've set it up correctly, to really create a less biased, if only it could ever be fully unbiased, create a much less biased recruiting process. And I think this exact same principle is at work here, that when you have those repeatable, objective, transparent, has to have transparency for this piece, when you have those transparent, repeatable kind of cornerstones of what everyone agrees is the goal and what people are being measured against, you can invite discussion, you can invite debate, and it's all above board and open for folks to kind of lean in and double check, and I think you need those eyes on what's going on to really ensure that equity and fairness is happening.
Well, in the mode of transparency, when you and I were talking earlier, is like taking a completely radically transparent approach to this. Like, what if every hire knew their quality of hire, right? We'll talk about a 4-letter word, this is going to radically transform the level of transparency you would bring to an organization. So I'm not saying that that's where you need to start, but that can be an end of where you're headed.
It's interesting. We have a number of customers that are going through some workforce optimization experiences. And there's one in particular that as we were getting the data into the engine, they were in the middle of that process. And what we found after the fact is that of the folks they had let go in their RIF, they had an 18% higher quality score than those who they had kept. And we're like, oh my God, right? And so it is to this point of just, gosh, if you get this data in, how is it going to help us, right, be more responsible in decision making across the whole plan? All right, let me shift gears to the shifting gears of the market around us right now. And so the quantity to quality shift, is it here whether we like it or not in this current climate?
Quantity to quality? I mean, no, I think we're in a different environment right now, and quantity is a big thing because there was so many hiring needs, there's great resignation, so many people turning over, we have to hire fast. But we cannot overlook quality, and we need to implement these things now, because if we're not tracking that, we're doing a disservice to the organization.
I think the markets do a lot of this over the years, and I think what we've seen over the last couple of decades in recruiting is this evolution. With this space, for those of us that have been around for a little while, have seen incredible evolution in this space and an increasing level of sort of, dare I say, sort of even sophistication. And I think as we think about incorporating quality of hire, and we become more sophisticated about how we think about the whole recruiting and talent space, and understanding that recruiting is filling jobs, which may be attrition or maybe new hires, and all the great stuff that can be generated from a company where employees are happy, they're referring their friends, great employer brand, and the way that that kind of virtuous circle, golden circle, can inform itself. And then, if you can reduce attrition, obviously you're reducing the workload on the talent team. And so as we get more sophisticated, I think we're kind of viewing this whole thing as a system, and I think that's another reason why this kind of rise of quality of hire is becoming so important. It's almost market agnostic, although obviously there are, pressures because of what we're seeing.
All right, good. So we have 2 minutes for questions, and then Amber is going to do a workshop on how you can activate quality of hire out of Greenhouse in less than 15 minutes. So that's what we're gonna hit after it. But does anybody have any questions for the group? Crickets. Got one. Yeah, sorry.
Mike's coming.
Just bring in a mic.
Check. All right. First of all, thank you everyone on the panel for your time and your insight. Really appreciate it. This question is meant to be a heady question, so I just want to give you a warning. So when you're thinking about calculating quality of hire, right? Thinking about that equation, how do you isolate the effects of variables on quality of hire that are outside of the hiring process? Things like org health, reorgs, the utility of the onboarding program, things that your talent acquisition team doesn't control, but has a direct impact on that speed to productivity. How do you isolate that so you get the noise out, you see the signal of, are we actually assessing for the factors that should indicate performance during that hiring process versus after the fact where you can't make any decisions around it because it's too late, you already hired.
I'd say, you have to first start with standardization before you can start isolating the variance that you're talking about here. So if you can find, let's just say your organization decides to do quality of hire after 30 days, right? Every employee, once they start, we're gonna ask them the following questions to a hiring manager after 30 days. Once you've isolated that, then you can take out the variance associated with something like a reduction in force or a merger and acquisition or whatever's going on, because you have historical trends over time, and you can say, oh, we saw this big spike downward or this big spike upward for whatever reason. Likely that's not attributed to that we just got that much better that month hiring people, but it was because of what's going on with Crosschq and TalentWall merging, so that's what's...
It is a heady one. I will tell you, when we sort of started this conversation today around the out-of-the-box math of 50-50 tenure performance, it means nothing, right? And so what we have learned is that there's all kinds of things that can impact, so we have to get more data into the machine to do more math. So things like culture and engagement really matter, guy might have been hired to come run a product that there was no fit in the market for that product, but I'm awesome, right? So those things matter. You know, Salesforce is really interesting. We do a lot of work with Salesforce, and rehireability is a theme that they use, which we have in our surveys. It's a really safe one that kind of covers some ground between straight performance. One of the challenges with performance, by the way, is that I think it's 80% of our new hires don't get a performance review within 6 months because they're not on the performance review cycle. So we're just flying blind, and especially with quick quits and then those early innings. So we've got to take whatever sources of data we can get our hands on to help feed the engine. But we know that engagement, we know that culture, we know that other external factors are all part of it. This concept of rehireability is a really safe and easy one to kind of get started with. But it does vary also just back to by the sector of the company and the type of the job. Just as I mentioned on the walkover, right? You have a different set of expectations for time to productivity and output for certain jobs than you have for other jobs. That's also part of the formula. You might be okay with 90 days to productivity for a certain type of hire, and they might only last 90 more days, and that might be enough for your ROI model, right? That's different for a doctor, right, or a data scientist or what have you. You can't take that chance. So it is complicated. That's why you need data. That's why this concept of talent intelligence and getting this all in the cloud and getting it all organized. We can't start to chip away at this unless we start to get some baselines and benchmarks. All right, any more questions? Okay, there's one in the back.
I heard one of y'all mention earlier today that you took a chance to look at a company that was doing a lot of assessments for sort of content or editorial teams, I can't remember the exact one, and decided that some of them were no longer needed or probably outdated. How do you determine in a company that does the whiteboard tools and all these different assessments throughout the whole process, what is needed, but against what we should take away? From a data perspective, too.
I love this one because the cocktail is different. I'll tell you, an even simpler one is the number of interviews that we do and looking at the curve based upon, there's perceptions if we do 8 interviews, we're going to have a higher likelihood of having a higher quality candidate. Well, that's not what our data says, right? So there's your cocktail within your organization. That's why you need a tool, in our opinion, because you're going to figure that out. You're going to figure out what's optimal in your organization, both from a pre-hire assessment perspective, from an interview perspective, just what your motion is. But you just can't get there until you start getting the data. I don't know that there's an out-of-the-box. I don't know that we know that there's an out-of-the-box one-size-fits-all for this, which I think is why you got to kind of invest in a machine and a system to do the math for you.
Well, I'll give TalentWall and Crosschq some credit here. So you can actually map out your hiring process and all the stage or phase gates, any kind of assessment in TalentWall, and you can immediately visualize, how effective that phase gate is at diversity, throughput, any kind of measure that you have internally at the moment. And the other thing on the Crosschq side of things is pushing that like Crosschq 360 as early in the process as you can get, because then you have what Joe and I were talking about earlier, this pre-hire quality rather than like post-hire quality, which is what we're talking about today. Is what's the candidate looking like from a holistic perspective way before they even start on the job?
All right, I think we are, one more question. And Amber, you want to come up here so we're ready for the transition?
Hello. Hey. So quick question for you. You were talking about, having a sufficient amount of data to calculate quality of hire. I guess the question is, what is the right amount of time, in terms of having data for X amount of time to feel confident in sort of your quality of hire evaluation? If that makes sense.
Well, the more data, the better. The more time, the better. The more predictive it gets, right? So it is always, I think for smaller organizations and stuff, to just have, especially when you're on a growth trajectory, you just don't have as much, you just don't have as much to look back on as well. I mean, we have. So I don't know a specific answer other than the fact that I think, companies smaller than 200 employees, right, are kind of tough to have adequate data based upon their hiring flows, just average out-of-the-box math. right? It's tough to get as deep as you want to get, as quickly as you want to get, but more is better. I wish there was a more specific answer. There's not really.
I mean, I look at the elbow in the data, and what I mean by that is, like, let's say it's retention. Where's the retention starting to level off? At our company, again, I mentioned the high levels of turnover. It's at 30 days, so 30 days makes a whole lot of sense. What if at your company it's more like 90 days or 6 months into the role even? Well, that's probably letting the data lead you to the solution that you have in your organization, because there is no set definition. It's tailored to not only your company, but the segments of your workforce at your company.
It seems like there can be ongoing quality that, coming back to the organization as well. Even 6 months, 9 months, a year, how are they performing towards expectations and what we thought would happen? So.
All right, let's do this. But Amber's going to show you how you can get this up and running in 15 minutes, regardless of your size of company, so you'll get a sense of how quick and easy it can be done.
Thank you. So we're going to do a quick kind of tutorial of how can you actually make this happen. So lots of great discussion just happened. I'm Amber. I, like Cole, have a background in industrial organizational psychology and people analytics. So I've never been a recruiter, but talent acquisition has been a key stakeholder and partner throughout my career, both when I was internal people analytics role at AbbVie and Whole Foods, and then since I've moved over to the vendor side of things, I've been consulting with and partnering with talent acquisition in that role. So I'm going to walk you through what can you do to make this happen. And I'm probably going to breeze through some of these initial setup because I think the panel did a really good job of covering what quality hire is, what some of the challenges are. I do want to focus here for a second though, around this whole idea of this is very difficult. So if you're feeling a little bit unsure of if this would work in your organization, if you would be successful, you're not alone, and it's very common. And one of the main reasons that I see is people focus too much on perfection when they are launching something like this. So I have something I say every time I talk about this, is it's about progress, not perfection, and it is different for every organization. So we just heard a whole bunch of conversation up here about how quality of hire is not one thing, there's not one answer, it's really complex, and you really have to take a step back and think, where can we start to have an immediate impact versus doing a one-year implementation of a really complex solution where the business is expecting you to deliver on something amazing, and then what if it doesn't work? So what we are going to talk about is a very simple solution, how you can launch with your greenhouse data and no other activation, quality of hire within your organization, and really start at a simple solution and get a really impact from that. So the first step is you connect your greenhouse API. This is literally copying and pasting. It's really simple. Crosschq is a preferred vendor with Greenhouse, and we have a lot of experience working with Greenhouse. From there, we have a pulse survey. So you launch Crosschq's pulse survey to help collect data. So some of these things that were just talked about on the panel around an organization not having data being siloed within the organization. Your company might have the data, but you're in talent acquisition, you don't have access to that data. You don't even know who the partner is to go to if you don't work with people analytics. They might not want to give you the data. So you can collect your own data with your partnership with Crosschq, and you can be ready to go. So in terms of implementation, you've copied and pasted your API between Greenhouse and Crosschq, and you've configured and launched your pulse survey. And this is where you decide what questions are you asking. So we just had that conversation around, would you rehire this individual is one of the most predictive and successful questions to ask. We would highly recommend you include that in your survey, but you have flexibility if that isn't a fit for your organization. You can ask other questions, like some of the examples up here. From there, you now have access to your on-demand quality of hire dashboard and reporting. So this is something that you are now empowered to be able to utilize and change the conversation within your organization and start to make a different kind of impact within your organization and have the business really maybe change the way that they view talent acquisition. So now we'll focus on what some of those data visualizations look like that you will have access to. And the first one is industry benchmarking. And sometimes people get excited about this, but sometimes they don't. I would say it depends on your company, but to me, the value of having industry benchmarks is context. So if you are talking about data within an organization and someone, your executive, wants to know, well, why does that matter? Are we doing good? Are we doing poor? Do we need to improve this? Are we world class? You can answer that question if you have benchmarks. And we provide that benchmarking for you, so you don't have to go out and find that benchmarking somewhere else and have another spreadsheet that you're pulling data from. The next one I'm going to talk about is quality of hire segmentation. So a lot of questions will come up around quality of hire once you have data available. One of the ones that is really common, that is really powerful for talent acquisition, is quality of hire by candidate source. Recruitment marketing is often a huge spend, agency spend, LinkedIn is a huge spend. So what if you could actually say, internal referrals, LinkedIn, the agency, you can really gauge the performance of your sourcing and be a lot more strategic about your recruitment marketing spend and change the conversation that you're having when it comes to budget season. So if you want to spend money on a new great sourcing tool, what if you had data, or you could show, well, if this doesn't work, I can hold the vendor accountable, and then I can put the money somewhere else where it's performing better. It's a different conversation when you can do that as a talent acquisition leader, and you don't have to submit a request to your people analytics team, if they exist in your company, and then get in their queue, get deprioritized continuously, and wait potentially 6 to 8 weeks, if you're lucky, it'll be that fast, to get your data back from your team. This one I'm also going to touch on. So we were talking a little bit, the panel was, about interview scores and the low correlation to quality of hire, as well as assessment. So that question I was asked earlier, how do you know what you can eliminate from your process? If you have an on-demand dashboard that is showing you this information, you don't have an assessment in the business for 10 years. That's not predictive when you have this type of data. So again, think of this as an empowerment tool, a way for you to hold your vendors accountable and to change the conversation that you have internally with your business. The last one that I will focus on is this whole idea of celebrating those star recruiters. So I think Cole is the one who used this example around, what if you are the star recruiter? What if you are killing it, but nobody knows that you are? When this dashboard exists, you're actually be able to see who is the top recruiter profile. You can celebrate that individual. If you as a leader are advocating for your team to get pay incentives or bonuses, then this changes that conversation for you as well. And it just helps you have more objective, data-driven conversations with the operators, because most of the time, the conversations I hear from talent acquisition leaders that are the most challenging are the ones that they're having with operators or business leaders, and they just have a disconnect, and they don't feel like they have enough data to have the conversation that the business leader cares about. And they will sit down and they will listen when you have data-driven conversations, and you can actually show them with data what it is that you are trying to achieve and the contribution that you're making to the organization. So with that, I have 20 seconds, and I can take a question.